All right, breaking news at 12:24 this Friday afternoon. We want to get right to Richmond, Virginia, where our Suzanne Kennedy has been monitoring big developments in the case of former First Lady Maureen McDonnell and her sentencing phase. Suzanne?
Scott, we are hearing within the last 10 minutes, Judge James Spencer has sentenced the former First Lady of Virginia, Maureen McDonnell, to 1 year and 1 day in a federal prison. Maureen McDonnell, of course, was convicted back in September on 8 federal counts. Her husband was convicted on 11. All throughout the morning, we heard from approximately 8 witnesses, including Maureen McDonnell's own daughter, Rachel. What she said is that her mom has lost everything and that she has literally become a recluse in her own home. We also heard from friends who say that she has lost her life's work. Maureen McDonnell spoke briefly, talking to the judge. My colleague Jeff Goldberg was in the courtroom right as this was happening. Jeff, what exactly did Maureen McDonnell say?
Well, it was really interesting to watch. She got up there and had to fight through some tears. One of the first things she said was she referenced what Judge Spencer had said during the sentencing of Governor Bob McDonnell, in which he said, "You allowed the serpent into the mansion," referring to the serpent as Johnny Williams, to which Maureen McDonnell responded today, quote, "The venom from that snake has poisoned my marriage, poisoned my family, and poisoned the Commonwealth that I love." Maureen McDonnell fighting through tears, apologizing, taking complete responsibility for what happened. Quote, "I am the one who opened the door, and I blame no one but myself. I never thought I had the credentials," referring to some of the struggles she had as being First Lady of the Commonwealth. She said, quote, "I started a chain of events that would bring pain and embarrassment to us all. I blame no one but myself." Clearly, she was very remorseful for what had happened and in tears, but fought through.
The interesting thing about this is during the entire trial and during the sentencing of her husband, we heard nothing from Maureen. This is the first time we have ever heard her speak publicly about these very powerful charges and her conviction.
Yeah, and in doing so, she was very revealing in terms of her position, not only asking for great forgiveness and mercy from Judge Spencer, but also being very blunt about how her life is these days. She says, quote, "I have been a prisoner in my own home. My marriage is broken, my family is hurting, and my reputation is in shatters." So clearly this was the first time that we had heard from her, but when we did hear from her, it was much more than just asking for forgiveness and mercy from the judge. It was really explaining a lot of her state of mind and how crushed she is as a human being, saying it's hard to imagine anything worse than what I've already endured. That was what she said. Judge Spencer had some interesting words himself. I'm just going to keep going here, Suzanne. He really talked about how he called this case tragic and sad, but also puzzling and bizarre. He said he was really struggling throughout this entire time to figure out who was the real Maureen McDonnell. Was she the person who had done so much good for so many people, been the caring mother, the caring wife, or was she this person that threw tantrums and that got completely crazy, as she was called, throughout the trial? He was trying to reconcile, who are we dealing with? Who is the real Maureen McDonnell?
That famous phrase, a nutbag, is what she was called. Yeah. And this judge obviously has spent a lot of time thinking about this, being very pensive. He was reading letters right up. He started court late this morning. Yeah. Also interesting, her daughter was the last one to speak at the sentencing. You know, what I found powerful about that was her saying it's really ripped apart my family, almost to the point perhaps of being irreparable. I thought that was a sad moment.
It was, and we've had Janine Zabowski McDonnell, who has spoken, McDonnell-Zabowski, who spoke on the stand. In particular, I think had many critical words about her own mother, and I think maybe Rachel alluding to the fact that some members of the family had spoken out against Maureen McDonnell, and close members of the, if not members of the immediate family, people close to the family, and that perhaps that damage is irreparable. So this is something that, you know, one thing that Maureen McDonnell was trying to stress dramatically, as were witnesses, was the damage is done. This is almost beyond repair, and things are completely shattered because of what's happened. But Judge Spencer, again, despite him expressing a lot of understanding for the situation that the family is in, felt that the punishment had to be served, and 1 year and 1 day is what he came down to. But again, it was just very fascinating to listen to him talk about. He really couldn't reconcile, couldn't understand. He had a lot of unease. Who is the real Maureen McDonnell? And he was clearly troubled with that all the way up until this morning, reading those letters you're referring to.
Her attorneys had asked for probation and for community service, 4,000 hours. And that was the point this morning that we heard about this very sweet, loving, caring for children, Maureen McDonnell. So you can understand where Judge Spencer's sort of disconnect with who the real Maureen McDonnell was. Was she the nutbag dirtbag that her former staff had spoken of time and time again? Or was she this woman who cared about veterans, who cared about women's issues, who cared about the Commonwealth? It's a puzzling sort of dichotomy.
Well, and what's fascinating is, as throughout the trial we always wondered, what is Judge Spencer really thinking about this? And as it turns out, he was probably thinking what a lot of us were thinking as we were listening. Who is this person for real? Is it this caring mother, caring wife, caring friend, or is it this person that, again, belittles employees and a quote that Judge Spencer said, embarrass and terrorize others from an unearned perch of power? So he was saying, I'm not really sure this is the best I can come up with. One thing that I do want to note in terms of what James Spencer said was, we talked so much during the trial itself about the defense that the McDonnells took, which was often deemed as throw her under the bus, right? Throw Maureen McDonnell under the bus. Judge James Spencer saying it himself, he called it the curious, let's throw mama under the bus defense, which he said then morphed into the sentencing phase, or leading up to the sentencing phase of Governor Bob McDonnell, and how so many people were saying great things about him. He said the let's throw mama under the bus defense turned into let's throw mama off the train. So again, a lot of the things that we have been talking about, that analysts have been talking about reviewing this case as the trial was going on, Judge Spencer clearly reading a lot of the things into it that we had as well.
You mentioned Bob McDonnell there. We had the typical scrum that we've had every single morning that this trial went on and through the sentencing, and you had a chance to go one-on-one with the governor and ask him a few questions, and he was saying he's ready for this to move into the next phase, if you will. Talk a little bit about that and what else he had to say about how he hoped things would go today.
Well, he had hoped that one thing he talked about was mercy, basically saying that Judge Spencer had shown mercy upon him, and he was hoping that I think the quote was, I hope that trend of mercy continues. Of course, when we were talking about the sentencing going into it for Bob McDonnell, there were expectations. You were looking at anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 years. The fact that the judge issued a sentence of 2 years certainly came as a lot of surprise to people, much lower than many had expected. Now, going into the sentencing today for Maureen McDonnell, the prosecution was asking for 18 months in prison. The defense was asking for 4,000 hours of community service and probation. Obviously, the judge leaning more towards what the prosecution had been asking for in terms of 1 year and 1 day in prison. But this is still a pretty stiff sentence if you look at what was being recommended by the prosecution, 18 months. I mean, he was definitely leaning more towards what they wanted.
And a stiff sentence when you think of who Maureen McDonnell was, and that's what we heard a lot of today, is that this was a woman who, headed up her kids' sports teams, who worked toward family dinners, who was highly reluctant to be the First Lady of Virginia, felt uncomfortable in her role, and suddenly now here she is, a convicted felon and on her way to prison, theoretically.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that's what she said essentially when she was reading her statement, or while she was speaking to the judge, saying, I wish I could turn back time, essentially saying, I brought this all upon myself. I started this chain of events, and here I am, and I have no one to blame but myself, and all I can do is ask for mercy. And so, yes, I think that what it really underscores in terms of the story of Maureen McDonnell is not only was Judge Spencer and so many of us trying to understand and reconcile who is the Maureen McDonnell, it also seems that she was trying to understand the real Maureen McDonnell, saying this behavior that I started, that's not really who I am, that's not really who I was. Something happened, something changed. This office, the responsibilities and the pressures of this office turned me into something that maybe I didn't want to be, and a person that I never expected I would be, saying I wish I could turn back time, but recognizing I can't do it. I made big mistakes, and please have mercy on me. And the judge obviously rendering his decision.
And clearly overwhelmed in her position that she did not want to begin with, but you saw a glimmer today of the mother in her when her daughter testified that her mom did not want her to take the witness stand, that during the trial she didn't want any of her 5 children to testify, but yet Rachel McDonnell said, I want to do this, and she looked very comfortable there, speaking about her mother and speaking about the role she played in the family. But again, there we saw Maureen McDonnell sort of going back to her roots, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that there was that motherly instinct, and Rachel McDonnell talking about how loving and kind her mother is. But again, she also returned to a theme that so many others returned to, is that once Maureen McDonnell was in the executive mansion as First Lady, it was a job she couldn't really handle, is what we're coming down to. I mean, Rachel McDonnell saying she wasn't very comfortable with her role as First Lady. She was uptight, on edge, frustrated. And these are the prosecutors.
We're taking a look at the U.S. attorneys. Mike, if you could just take a look over here. They're coming. They're walking down to the hotel. Will you be making a statement later? Will you be making a statement?
Have a good day.
Have a good day. Sounds like they're not going to speak at all.
Michael Dry was the lead prosecutor in this case, saying have a good day, walked out with a bit of a smile. We will hear from Dana Bente, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. So the prosecution will be making a statement, just not from the prosecutors who tried this case day in and day out. But again, going back to what we were talking about before, about this idea of this person who was this loving mother and caring friend and kind wife, once she got into the role of First Lady, it was clearly something that overwhelmed her dramatically. Witnesses said it, family members said it, and today Maureen McDonnell said it herself.
It was almost as if she was poisoned when she got into the mansion, as that she didn't quite know how to handle the responsibilities, and it started a downward spiral. You know, and it's interesting. I mean, Judge Spencer started this whole metaphor of the Johnny Williams being the snake during the sentencing of Bob McDonnell, and Maureen McDonnell took the ball and ran with it, continuing with that theme again, saying the venom from that snake poisoned the house, poisoned the family, poisoned the Commonwealth. So the theme of poison certainly playing not just in terms of how we analyze it, but also in the courtroom as well. Let's talk next. So obviously Bob McDonnell sentenced last month, originally given a February 9th date to show up for prison, but immediately filed an appeal. Where do things stand as far as when we move forward with him, and what will likely happen with Maureen? So the appeal will happen almost immediately from Maureen McDonnell's attorneys as well. The oral arguments in the appeal for Bob McDonnell will take place on May 12th, Tuesday, May 12th in Richmond. I don't know whether Maureen McDonnell's oral arguments, appeal arguments will take place the same day. I would assume they would, but I don't know. But again, that's what we're waiting to see where things go from here. As the appeal plays out, of course, Bob McDonnell is out on bond, did not have to go to prison, as you mentioned. Presumably Maureen McDonnell will be in the same situation. She will not have to go to prison as the bond is pending, or as the appeal is pending. We'll hear the oral arguments in May, and then we'll see where things go from there. All right. A few notes also. They still live in separate houses. They're selling their home here in Henrico County. It's a sad part of this whole story is how the family has deteriorated, and that's what her daughter was speaking about. We're going to wait to hear from attorneys here. We ultimately will hear from them, and we will bring that to you live. But for now, that's all. Reporting live from the federal courthouse in Richmond. Back to you.
All right, Suzanne Kennedy, Jeff Goldberg, top-notch reporting out of Richmond. Thank you so much.